"You're just the janitor," Trevor Dane said, loud enough for the entire executive lounge to hear. "This floor isn't a daycare. Keep your daughter away from the espresso machine, and maybe teach her not to stare at success while she's at it." Mason didn't flinch. He reached down, took Eloise's hand, and turned to leave. But just before they stepped past the frosted glass doors, he looked over his shoulder. "Funny," he said softly. "You're standing on the floor I used to design war games for. Your company bought the algorithm 3 years ago." The room fell still. Trevor blinked. "What?" Mason didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the chessboard being set up across the room for that afternoon's team-building challenge. "You might want to open with E4, he added, "if you're into short games. Subscribe now because this won't be a cleaning story for long. It's a dismantling. And the first piece just moved. He wasn't supposed to be here." That was the unspoken rule hanging in the air, the one Trevor Dane enforced with expensive shoes and weaponized smirks. Mason Reed had walked this floor long before the company moved in, but no one cared about that now. They only saw the badge that said facilities. They saw a man pushing a cart, not a strategist who once sat behind mirrored glass rooms in government labs. He'd given up that life when Eloise was born, chose being present over powerful, chose bedtime stories over war simulations, and he'd never regretted it, not once, until today. Until Eloise stood beside him, lip trembling, because a man in a $1,000 suit decided to make her small. She was just looking at the chessboard. That's what started it. Mason had paused for a moment after cleaning the glass panels. She loved chess, had been studying it since she was 6. She was curious. That was all. But to Trevor, that curiosity looked like contamination. And to the employees gathered around, the ones too afraid to speak up, it was just another lesson in who belonged where. He could have walked away. He should have walked away. But she had looked up at him then, eyes glassy with confusion, and whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" And that was the moment Mason made the decision. She didn't need him to win a fight. She needed to see that dignity doesn't cower when money shouts. And if this arrogant man wanted a stage, Mason would give him one, with a pawn in hand and a clock ticking. Where are you watching from? Because Trevor Dane just insulted the wrong man's child in front of the wrong chessboard. And the next move isn't going to be silent. The air in the executive lounge slowly resumed its chatter, but something about it had changed. Conversations felt thinner, less secure, like people were pretending not to glance toward Mason as he walked away with his daughter. A few assistants whispered, their eyes flicking between him and the board. He didn't acknowledge them. He knew that look, the one where curiosity tries to dress itself as disbelief. He'd seen it before, years ago, in the military rooms where analysts scoffed at janitor-level clearances until they saw his name on the simulation results. Eloise held his hand a little tighter. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "He did." That stopped him. She was only 9, too young to be learning the language of power and cruelty this way. They stepped into the elevator. Mason hit the button for B1, maintenance level. The doors closed, muffling the wealth upstairs. It was quieter here, cooler, a different kind of hum. The scent of cleaning solution lingered in the air, not cologne. "You know I've been teaching you the wrong openings," he said, offering her a small smile. "You keep letting me win." Her face lit up just a little. "That's because you need it." He laughed under his breath, but something behind the amusement stayed sharp. The kind of edge that doesn't dull with time, only hides until it's needed. By the time they reached the janitor's locker room, Mason's mind was already moving, shifting, assessing, replaying Trevor's smug grin over the chessboard. The same board the CEO had installed as a joke, a brain exercise, between meetings. Trevor was hosting a company-wide chess tournament later that day. The invite had been plastered across all staff emails, complete with prize incentives, snacks, and some thin language about boosting morale. Employees could challenge anyone, even executives. Anyone, of course, except the janitor. That was made clear. Not in writing, but in practice. Mason had overheard Trevor more than once talking about optics, how success had to look a certain way, tailored, expensive, unapologetic. He turned toward the shelf where he kept his tool bag. Beneath it, in a thin felt pouch, sat a piece of his past. Not a medal or photo. Just a knight, chipped on one edge, its face dulled with time. He hadn't touched it in years. He hadn't needed to. Eloise wandered to the corner where her chessboard sat folded. She opened it slowly, began placing the pieces. "Can I play white today?" "Always," he said. They played in silence for a while. She opened with d4, aggressive, sharp. He countered, watching her eyes scan the board with a seriousness that made his throat catch. At one point she frowned, reached out, and adjusted one of her pieces. "You're trying to trap me?" she said. "Maybe. You're not pushing the center." Observation noted. She smiled. He was training her without her realizing it. That was the best kind of learning, when it felt like discovery instead of instruction. After 10 more moves, she narrowed her eyes. "This isn't the way you usually play." "I know." Her fingers hovered above a rook. "You're practicing for him." The silence stretched. "I don't want you to," she added, softer this time. "You already won." Mason looked at her. He didn't see you, and he wanted to make sure everyone else didn't either. "You think he'll stop at words next time?" Eloise looked down at the board. "But you said you don't play anymore." "I don't." She tilted her head. "But you still remember how." Mason reached forward and took her bishop. She gasped. "That's cheating." "It's knowing your patterns," he said, "and it's what he won't expect." Upstairs, Trevor Dane had already started rehearsing his victory speech. Mason could hear it in his head. Jokes about intellectual superiority, backhanded compliments for the effort his team put in, maybe even a feigned show of humility if he lost a round or two early on. But Mason wasn't around. He was a mirror. And Trevor wouldn't like what he saw in it. There was a knock at the locker room door. It was Danny, the youngest maintenance crew member, clutching a walkie and looking breathless. "You might want to see this," he said. "Your kid just sort of declared war." Mason frowned. "What?" "She wrote a note, slipped it into the tournament box upstairs. It says, 'My dad can beat your CEO.'" He grinned sheepishly. "Everyone saw it. Trevor's got it. People are laughing. But it's that nervous kind of laugh." Mason blinked. Eloise, frozen beside the board, suddenly looked very small. "I didn't think he'd read it," she said. "I just didn't want him to think he scared you." He crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. She didn't cry, just stared at the floor, like it had disappointed her. "You did nothing wrong," he said again, "but now he's going to fire you." Mason stood slowly. "Maybe. But first, he's going to play me." He picked up the chipped knight from its pouch and slipped it into his pocket. It was time to dust off more than the floors. The chessboard in the executive lounge was already surrounded by interns and junior staff by the time Mason returned to his rounds. Conversations hummed with low excitement. Someone had brought in branded coffee cups and a tray of pastries from the high-end bakery down the street. It looked more like a networking brunch than a team-building exercise. Mason didn't stop. He moved quietly along the outer edge of the room, pushing his supply cart, pausing only to wipe the glass display cases lining the far wall. His reflection shimmered faintly in the pane, overlaid by moving figures in suits laughing around the chessboard. Trevor was already holding court. He sat comfortably in one of the leather armchairs, elbows resting on the armrests like a king surveying his domain. His tailored navy suit caught the light just enough to remind everyone of its cost. Open to anyone who wants to try, he was saying. Emphasis on anyone who understands the game, of course. Laughter rippled through the group. It was performative, but loud enough to sting. One of the HR coordinators raised a hand from the crowd. Does that include the facilities staff? Trevor leaned back, grinning. Sure, if they can spell Sicilian defense, they can play. A few chuckles this time, more hesitant. No one mentioned the note, but the tension in the room had shape now. Mason could feel it curling at the edges. He turned away from the board and kept wiping the case, working in small circles. The glass was already spotless. He just needed to move, to stay invisible a little longer. That night, as he packed up supplies in the B1 storage closet, Mason found a folded slip of paper tucked under his thermos. It was a printed sign-up sheet. Chess Challenge Roster, Day 1. His name was at the bottom, typed neatly, signed in by someone else. He looked around the empty hallway, but no one was there. He could have ignored it. Could have walked upstairs the next day and pretended not to see the bracket posted on the office screens. But curiosity, strategic curiosity, was a stubborn flame. So he checked the bracket anyway. Mason Reed, scheduled opponent. Trevor Dane. Round 1. The crowd around the screen hadn't noticed him, not yet. But a few of the younger analysts lingered behind, whispering too closely to avoid suspicion. He heard his name. Heard one of them say, "Is that the guy from the summit video?" He didn't stop walking, but he filed the phrase away. Someone was digging. By midday, Trevor had caught wind of the matchup, and he wasn't amused. He called an all-hands meeting for tone setting. The kind of mandatory performance that disguised control as culture. "Let's be clear," Trevor said from the head of the boardroom table, fingers tented with theatrical calm. "This tournament is meant to be fun. A little morale booster. That doesn't mean we need distractions from people who don't belong in the competition." Mason was in the back of the room, wiping the inside of the conference fridge. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but he didn't leave either. Trevor's eyes met his briefly. Just a flicker. "Of course," Trevor added. "If someone wants to embarrass themselves on a live stream, I won't stop them. Just don't say I didn't offer an out." Laughter this time was forced, uneasy. Mason closed the fridge door and rolled his cart past the table. For a moment, the room fell silent. He didn't look at Trevor, but he did stop at the door, adjusted his grip on the cart handle, and said, without turning around, "I never needed an out." He left the room. After that, things shifted, not dramatically, but people stopped laughing, not at him anyway. They started watching. And Trevor didn't like being watched, not this way. By late afternoon, Mason's locker had been checked. HR had updated his shift schedule, trimming his hours for budget realignment. Eloise's building access card had been suspended for security protocols, everything just outside the legal line, but pointed enough to leave a mark. He didn't complain, he just studied. He took his breaks with an old paperback chess manual and a blank notepad, scribbling variations with a half-broken pencil. People passed by and stared. One intern asked to borrow the book. Mason handed it over wordlessly. The next day, 2 more names dropped from the tournament bracket. Voluntary withdrawals. Trevor remained at the top. Mason stayed at the bottom. The countdown had begun. The date was set. 1 match, no replays, no rematches, and no resets for what was about to happen. Eloise wasn't waiting in the lounge the next evening. She sat on the maintenance-level floor, legs crossed, her school tablet balanced on her knees. But her eyes weren't on the screen. They were fixed on the little fold-out chessboard spread out in front of her, half played, the pieces frozen mid-conflict. Mason watched her from the doorway for a moment, wiping sweat and dust from his hands with a faded rag. The knight piece, the old chipped one, sat at the edge of the board. Out of play. Set aside. "You're not finishing the game?" he asked. She shook her head. "I made a bad move. He's trapped." Mason stepped inside and crouched next to her. "Which piece?" She pointed at a black pawn caught between two white rooks. "I pushed it too far," she muttered. He studied the board. "Looks like you opened early." "I wanted to attack." He smiled. "That's the thing about pawns. They can get ahead of themselves if they forget what they're guarding." She reached for the chipped knight, hesitated, then pulled her hand back. Mason knew that feeling, the one where the smallest piece feels too heavy to lift. It had been years since he'd entered a real game, and even then it wasn't across a physical board. It was simulation-based, virtual warfare, algorithms calibrated for attrition patterns, AI reflex loops, psychological misdirection techniques. He'd trained machines to think several layers deep, while burying his own talent underneath floor wax and silence. Now the match was real. No software, no buffering. And it was personal. Upstairs, the posters had changed. Mason's name was no longer a joke. It had become a question, a curiosity. The bracket screen now flashed match previews between departments, showing profile photos and short bios. Trevor's read like a tech magazine interview. Graduate of a top school, venture-backed founder, known for strategic foresight. Mason's slot was blank. No image, no text. Just a silhouette and a time. It was as if the system didn't know what to call him. "Am I allowed to come up and watch?" Eloise asked suddenly. He turned to her. "No, they restricted your badge." She looked down. "I didn't mean to start trouble." "You didn't?" "I wanted him to see you." Mason picked up the chipped knight and turned it slowly in his fingers. The edge of its face was worn smooth, like it had been passed between generations. "Then he'll see," he said. The day of the match arrived in fragments. Early chatter, suspicious glances, departmental whispers. Someone from PR was setting up a live feed, broadcasting the tournament finals to the company's private internal network. It had gone from a novelty to a spectacle. Mason stepped into the executive lounge, freshly cleaned, but not for him. The chessboard sat under a glowing light fixture. Two ergonomic chairs faced off across the mahogany table. Cameras were discreet, but visible. Trevor hadn't arrived yet. People stood along the perimeter, some pretending to look busy, others openly waiting. Mason could feel their skepticism pressing in like humidity. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not just in the match, but in the story. He didn't fit the narrative they were used to. He walked to the board, sat down. No pretense, just a deep breath. The doors opened with a hiss of conditioned air. Trevor entered, surrounded by a small entourage of marketing staff and his personal assistant. His smile was tight, teeth too white for comfort. "Well," he said as he took the seat across from Mason, "let's make this fast." Mason said nothing. The timer was set. Trevor adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "You know, this'll be streamed to about 4,000 people. And archived, of course." Mason's gaze didn't waver. Trevor leaned forward. "So if this is some kind of statement, make it quick. People have real work to do." A junior employee handed Mason a company-branded pen to sign the match waiver. Mason ignored it and pulled a pencil from his breast pocket. It was dull and worn. He signed with that. The game began. Trevor opened with E4. Mason responded with C5. The Sicilian. A few eyebrows raised around the room. Trevor grinned, clearly pleased. "Didn't think you'd know that one." Mason didn't reply. He watched, waited. Every piece Trevor moved echoed with self-assurance. Every counter Mason placed was quiet, deliberate, forming a shape no one could yet see. 5 moves in, the tone had shifted. The crowd leaned closer. Trevor's brow furrowed. 10 moves in, a murmur passed through the room. By move 13, a senior engineer had pulled out her phone and begun recording. Trevor noticed. He leaned back, attempting nonchalance. "Still got that janitor silence, huh? You know what they say? Mop in one hand, manual in the other." Mason calmly slid a knight across the board. Trevor stared at it, then at him. The knight was angled perfectly, forking the queen and rook. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just sat there as Trevor's lips parted slightly, then closed. The board had shifted, and so had the room. The room didn't fall silent, it tightened. Not all at once, but gradually, like a coil winding itself without anyone noticing. The chatter stopped. Phones lowered, shoulders straightened. Something in the air had changed, and not even the espresso machine dared to hum. Trevor stared at the board longer than he needed to. Mason had forked 2 of his most powerful pieces with a single knight. It wasn't flashy, but it was precise, clean enough that the message wasn't lost. He blinked once, adjusted his cuff, and moved his bishop to deflect. It was a safe play. Not brilliant, not terrible, safe. Mason made his next move without hesitation. Trevor waited. Maybe for a smirk, maybe for a flinch, some sign that Mason had just been lucky. But there was none. The janitor wasn't posturing. He wasn't calculating a facade. He was just playing. And somewhere near the back of the crowd, someone whispered, "That's the Prague trap." Another voice, lower this time. "No, it's deeper. He's setting up a mirrored response." Trevor's eyes lifted at that. He scanned the edges of the room. There were more faces now. Word had spread. Staff from departments that didn't even share a floor had found excuses to linger. Even a few mid-level execs leaned discreetly near the pillars, arms folded, observing. He didn't like being observed, not this way. He cleared his throat. "I hope you're not just mimicking a line you watched online," he muttered under his breath. "Wouldn't want to embarrass yourself in front of my people." Mason's gaze didn't shift. "I don't need your lines. I wrote some of the originals." Trevor's hand hovered over his queen for a second too long. Across the lounge, Lila, an associate from R&D, pulled out her phone. Not to record the match, but to search. Her thumbs moved quickly, eyes narrowed, focus unshaken. Mason saw her, not directly, but in the periphery. The behavior was familiar. It had started. He moved his pawn with the calm of a man pushing open a door he'd already walked through. Lila froze, then looked up at Mason, then back down. She nudged her colleague beside her, showed him the screen, and tilted it discreetly toward another. A ripple. She had found it. A photograph from a military journal article, grainy but recognizable. Mason in a navy blue suit standing next to an AI command interface, a government insignia half blurred behind him. A caption. Reed explains recursive chess logic patterns to military wargaming AI team's Prague conference. She didn't say a word, just passed the phone along. And it spread, one whisper at a time. Trevor hadn't noticed yet. His focus remained stubbornly fixed on the board, irritation growing behind his eyes. His next move was too aggressive. He tried to force an exchange, pushing Mason to defend. Mason didn't defend. He pivoted, sacrificed the knight. Trevor's eyes lit up. Finally, a mistake. He took it. But the next 2 moves locked him in place. His king was still safe, but everything else felt cornered. Too many pieces suddenly stranded. Too many lanes closed. He looked up again. The expressions around the room had changed. Not pity, not discomfort, but recognition. curiosity giving way to something else. Lila was now whispering to James from legal. James, a known chess hobbyist, tapped his watch face to open a split-screen diagram of the board state. He zoomed, tilted, then muttered, "He's 7 moves ahead, at least." Trevor's assistant leaned in and said quietly, "Do you want me to end the stream?" Trevor shook his head. Not yet. He couldn't. Not now, not when everyone was watching. He made another play, overconfident, a reflex wrapped in pride, and Mason punished it immediately, not brutally, elegantly. A rook repositioned itself behind a pawn wall. "That's a vault," someone whispered. Another reply, sharper this time. "He's not just trying to win, he's trying to teach." Trevor heard that one, his jaw set. "You've done this before," he said aloud, voice edged. Mason's expression didn't change. "I told you to open with e4. A few people stifled laughter. Trevor's hands curled at his sides. "You could have asked to play anyone. Why me?" Mason's tone didn't rise. "You're the one who wanted to prove something." "And what are you trying to prove?" Mason didn't answer. He moved his bishop just one space, not aggressive, but final. The realization crept into Trevor's face slowly. It wasn't checkmate yet, but the next move made it inevitable. Not just probable, not avoidable. Trevor sat back in his chair. The voices in the room weren't whispers anymore. People were calling it what it was, a dismantling. James was openly documenting it on his iPad now. Lila pulled up the military conference footage. Someone else quietly pulled Mason's name into LinkedIn, only to discover there wasn't a profile at all, only dead links and references in declassified papers. The silence from Mason was louder than any speech Trevor could have made. It was too late to stop the leak, too late to reclaim the room, too late to pretend this was a game. It wasn't the move that undid Trevor, it was the recognition. Slow, widening, irreversible. Not on the board, but in the room. People didn't just see Mason now, they were recalibrating him. It started with James, who stood from his seat near the back of the lounge, tablet still in hand, his voice cutting clean through the murmuring. "Guys, this man isn't just good. He's cited in the old NATO war game logs. That's not a coincidence." No one asked how he found it so fast. No one needed to. The leak had turned into a search party. Screens were already lighting up across the room, the unspoken question on everyone's faces. Who the hell is the janitor? Mason didn't respond. His fingers rested gently on the edge of the chessboard. His gaze never left Trevor. The CEO, for the first time in the entire tournament, hesitated before touching a piece. He leaned back, blinked. His bravado was slipping, but not from a single blunder. It was something more painful. The quiet crawl of understanding that this match wasn't the real threat. It was the audience. Trevor glanced around and saw it. His employees looking at Mason with something dangerously close to awe. Reverence even. He hated it. "I don't care where you used to work," Trevor muttered, just loud enough to carry. "This is a company, not a strategy simulation." Still, Mason didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to a sound no one else could hear. "Companies are built on patterns too," he said. "You just haven't learned to read yours yet." Trevor pushed out of his seat abruptly and paced behind it, jaw clenched. The camera still streamed live from the corner of the room, red light blinking steady. Someone had added a caption. "Final round, Reed versus Dane." Reed. They were using his name now. Not janitor. Not maintenance. Trevor saw it. The shift in language. The shift in status. He returned to the board, eyes narrowing. "So that's it? You show up for one game and everyone forgets who runs this building?" Mason didn't answer. Trevor snapped his next move. Too fast, too sharp. A rushed bishop retreat, defensive and awkward. Mason met it with a quiet reposition of his pawn structure. It didn't threaten anything directly, but it boxed Trevor in another square. And then it happened. A low voice from the corner. One of the older custodians, Marisol, who'd worked the night shift for over a decade. She rarely spoke during daylight hours, but now, watching from the edge of the room with her arms crossed, she said, without lifting her voice, "He used to train machines. I saw him on a panel, years ago. Thought he looked familiar." Trevor's head snapped toward her. "You knew?" "I clean too, Trevor," she replied, not blind. Laughter rippled through the room, soft but unmistakable. Trevor's fingers curled into fists. Mason moved again. This time his knight danced diagonally behind the queen. A quiet rearrangement that forced Trevor to abandon the flank. And now it was clear. Mason wasn't just winning. He was disassembling Trevor's ego one layer at a time. The pieces didn't look threatening alone, but the deeper structure, those who could read the game saw it now, was airtight. Every square Trevor hoped to escape into was already covered, just not in ways that drew attention. A trap written in patience. Whispers filled the room. Someone murmured, "He's playing for checkmate, not just victory." Another, "He's playing him, not the game." Trevor finally leaned in and whispered, "What do you want out of this? A promotion? A spotlight? You think I'm going to hand you something for embarrassing me?" Mason blinked slowly. "My daughter was watching," he said flatly. Trevor's face tightened. "That's what this is about?" he scoffed. "Your kid?" Mason moved his queen, not for an attack, but to reinforce the baseline of his defense. A move that showed he had no fear of pressure, that he was 10 steps ahead, and protecting something deeper than a title. "I don't need you to respect me," he said, "but you will remember her face the next time you try to make someone feel small." Trevor opened his mouth to fire back, but nothing came out, because Mason hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stood, hadn't insulted him, and yet he was winning. Someone at the back of the lounge clapped once, quiet, instinctive, then stopped. But it was too late. The spell had broken. The silence was no longer reverence for Trevor. It was waiting for Mason's next move. And Trevor knew, without a doubt, the game wasn't about chess anymore. The timer ticked on, steady and indifferent, counting down the seconds between moves. But neither man touched a piece. Trevor sat frozen, fingers pressed tight against the armrests, his posture trying to suggest confidence but sinking into rigidity. His jaw clenched just enough to show the strain. Sweat had gathered just below his temple, catching in the spotlight glare of the camera above. Mason waited, not to pressure, not to intimidate, just to let the weight settle. He wasn't rushing. He never rushed. Timing had always been his ally, not his enemy. In strategy work, hesitation wasn't weakness. It was data. A stall revealed more about your opponent than the move itself. And Trevor was revealing plenty. Around them, the lounge was packed. Not with noise, but with presence. Executives who once walked past Mason without a glance were now leaning against the walls with their arms crossed, watching. Analysts whispered theories to one another. Engineers traced board positions on napkins, replicating the match with awe. Marketing associates typed notes on company tablets, pretending to work while eyeing each exchange. The room had turned into a theater, and Trevor was losing his spotlight. His eyes snapped to Mason, trying to find something. Indignation, anger, pride. But there was only calm. Composure sharpened by purpose. Trevor finally made his move. He slid a pawn forward, not to advance his position, but to create distance. Breathing room. A stall. Mason responded instantly, his rook shifting across the back row, connecting both ends of the board. A simple gesture, but one that tightened the net. Gasps were audible this time. The trap was visible now, even to the less experienced. Not immediate checkmate, but structural dominance. Mason didn't just hold the center. He had every escape route in sight, every pressure point braced. Trevor wasn't being attacked. He was being contained. Still, he tried to speak through it. "You know none of this means anything, right?" he muttered. "You beat me in a game. That doesn't make you anything more than a janitor with a hobby." Mason studied the board, then looked up, his eyes meeting Trevor's with the same cold clarity he used to brief generals. Behind closed doors. "I didn't beat you yet." The bluntness struck harder than any brag. Trevor leaned back, crossed his arms. "So what? You're some kind of hero now? Want me to make a statement to the company? Apologize? Post your resume on the wall?" Mason didn't respond, because it wasn't about any of that. He had no interest in being paraded. The silence pressed heavier. Then came the shift. Subtle, but undeniable. From the hallway someone entered. A woman in her 50s, tailored blazer, no name tag. Her steps were crisp, her presence louder than her voice. Heads turned, phones lowered. Trevor saw her and stiffened. Mara. Mara Lee, board member, investor, quiet architect of the company's survival during the early years. She was rarely seen in public meetings, even less in company lounges. She walked straight to the side of the board and stood there without a word. Trevor rose instinctively. "We're in the middle of—" She held up a hand, just once, then turned to Mason. "You still play by the old clocks?" she asked. He looked up at her, curious. "I'm not picky." She smiled faintly. "Neither were the colonels you used to brief." A pulse ran through the crowd. She knew. Trevor blinked. "Wait, how do you—" "I was at Prague. You think military AI strategy stays in its box?" She folded her arms. "Some of us remember who built the architecture your products rely on." The implication landed hard. Trevor tried to recover. "Look, that's not relevant. This is a startup, not a—" "Then maybe you should stop treating it like a game you've already won." It wasn't just the statement. It was who said it, and when. Trevor swallowed hard and sat down again. He moved his queen defensively, but the pattern was clear. He was no longer playing to win. He was playing to survive. Mason finished his next move with a gentle touch. No flair, just inevitability. And across the room, Mara nodded. "You know," she said to the room, not just to Trevor, "we keep searching for innovative minds. But maybe we should start looking for the ones we buried under our own egos." Trevor's lips thinned. Mason said nothing. He didn't need to. The pieces on the board spoke louder than any corporate speech, and for the first time in the company's history, silence felt like leadership. The board no longer looked like a game. It looked like a map. One man boxed into a corner, the other quietly closing in piece by piece. Mason's rook now flanked Trevor's queen. His bishop occupied the diagonal that shadowed the king's only open square. The pawns, still humble in position, had begun to resemble a noose. Trevor's mobility was vanishing, but what cut deeper than the positioning was the shift in posture. His opponent sat like a man who had nothing to prove and everything already understood. And the room reflected that understanding. Gone were the polite half-smiles and murmured doubts. People weren't watching to be entertained anymore. They were watching because the illusion they'd upheld for years, the structure of who mattered and who didn't, was dissolving right in front of them. Trevor felt it. His hands, always steady in negotiation, now hovered hesitantly before each move. His shirt collar clung tighter to his neck, and he tugged at it between turns like it might loosen the pressure in the room. Mason never looked rushed. He rested his fingers on the table edge, breathing evenly, waiting out Trevor's faltering tempo. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't even tactical. It was the rhythm of someone who had trained in long games, drawn-out negotiations where the consequences were measured in more than just captured pieces. Across the room, James leaned over to Lila again. He's baiting Trevor into castling late, but by now it'll trap the king in a corner. Why's he doing that? Lila whispered back. To show restraint, James replied. He could have ended this already. Mason heard them, not the words but the tone. He was used to decoding rooms. The energy was different now, no longer curious, not quite reverent, but closer to something else, witnessing. The CEO's breath grew audibly shallow as he moved his rook one square, defensive, avoidant, not part of any plan. He was stalling. Mason countered with a precise knight movement. Not a flashy attack, just quiet control. And then, from the lounge entrance, came a voice sharp enough to cut the air. "He's pacing you like it's an opening seminar," said a woman in a slate gray suit. Everyone turned. Daria Chen, the company's VP of Risk Management, another executive who rarely left her corner office, unless something was truly off the rails. She approached the board with folded arms, not looking at Mason, not looking at Trevor, but at the chess pieces themselves. "This isn't a match," she said. "It's an autopsy. You're just too proud to realize the body's yours." Trevor scoffed under his breath, trying to maintain face. "If you came to offer commentary, Daria, there's a seat near the back." "I'm not here to comment," she said coolly. "I'm here because legal pinged me. You pushed through schedule changes, unauthorized badge deactivations, and altered a janitor's HR file without documentation." Trevor's head snapped toward her. "That was internal protocol." She raised a hand. "Save it. We're auditing. You'll be hearing from compliance." The statement was delivered like a move across a board, final, well-timed, and absolute. Trevor paled slightly. Mason remained still. Daria's eyes finally met his. "Nice to see you again, by the way. You probably don't remember me. I was at the Lisbon AI briefing. You were on the panel that tore my logic tree apart in 6 minutes." A faint smile ghosted Mason's lips. "That tree needed pruning?" Daria let out a dry laugh. "Still does." Trevor shoved his chair back with a little too much force, rising to his feet as if that could reclaim the tempo. "Enough of this," he barked. "I'm not going to be lectured by my staff about a publicity stunt. He doesn't even work here." "You're wrong," Mara said quietly from her corner. Trevor's head swiveled. "Excuse me?" "He does," Mara continued. "He's been working here longer than you've been in your office. The only difference is now, everyone sees it." Trevor pointed toward the board. "This is a distraction, a stunt, a damn janitor humiliating the executive suite over a board game." "It's not a game to him," Daria cut in. "It never was." Mason stood, not quickly, not with drama. He simply rose, as if that was always the natural conclusion of this posture. "You're right," he said. "I don't work in your office. I clean around it. I listen while people talk in rooms they think are soundproof. I know which coffee you spill when you're nervous, which assistant you yell at when deals fall through." He stepped toward the board, one square at a time. "And you? You sit there like your words are architecture, like your name insulates you. But it doesn't. Not anymore." Trevor stepped back as Mason's hand reached out, not to touch a piece, but to pause above it. "If you're afraid of being humiliated," Mason said, "you should have resigned before you opened with E4. And then he moved. A final slide of his bishop. Smooth, exact, and irreversible. Check. Not mate, not yet. But the walls were closing, and there was nowhere left to hide. Trevor didn't sit back down. He hovered behind his chair, arms crossed, one foot tapping against the polished tile like he could drum up an escape. The lounge no longer felt like his domain. It felt like a courtroom where he wasn't sure who the judge was. And Mason? Mason stayed standing. He didn't lean forward, didn't posture. He simply observed the board like a man watching the last grains slip through the neck of a glass timer. A few feet away, someone in legal cleared their throat. "He's got 5 forced moves, all losing." James muttered, "That's generous." Trevor must have heard. His neck stiffened. He looked back down at the board, and finally, reluctantly, sat. His fingers hovered near his king, then pulled back. Touching it would mean acknowledging the position for what it was, and that acknowledgement, more than the loss itself, scraped at the pride stitched into his every breath. "You've made your point," he said. Mason tilted his head slightly. "Have I?" Trevor's face darkened. "You think beating me in front of a few interns changes anything?" But no one was laughing now, not even the interns. A new hush settled over the room, thicker than before, one built not on curiosity, but recognition. That this wasn't just a game being won, it was an imbalance corrected, a weight slowly tipping back into place. "I didn't challenge you," Mason said. "You ridiculed my daughter for being curious, and you tried to make her feel like she didn't belong." Trevor snorted. "You want me to apologize to a child?" "I want you to remember her face," Mason said, calm and steady. "So the next time you decide someone is beneath you, you hesitate." Trevor looked up sharply. "You're acting like I'm some kind of tyrant." "You're acting like you're not." It landed, harder than anything so far, because this wasn't coming from rage or ego or even revenge. It came from stillness. From a man who knew exactly how many times he'd been unseen and how often silence was mistaken for weakness. From the hallway outside, a quiet bell chimed. End of shift. The lounge lights dimmed slightly, enough for the reflections in the windows to grow sharper. In the glass, Trevor could now see himself, and behind him, rows of his employees, watching, waiting, no longer afraid of being seen doing so. He looked back at the board, then reached out. He moved a pawn, one space forward. It wasn't defense. It wasn't strategy. It was motion for motion's sake, a refusal to tip the king. Mason didn't react. He waited the customary few seconds, then replied with a mirrored push. Not because he needed to, but because Trevor needed to see. It wasn't personal. It was inevitable. More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone near the corner whispered, "He's not ending it yet." "He's giving him a choice," another said. Trevor's lips twitched. Whether from frustration or fear, it wasn't clear. Mason spoke again. "This isn't about who wins. You lost long before this match." Trevor's eyes narrowed. "You lost when you treated everyone beneath your title as invisible," Mason continued. "When you stopped listening to people unless they were holding something you wanted." Mara Lee, silent since part 7, now stepped closer. "We built this company on systems that work because of people like him, not despite them." Daria added, "You might hold the highest office, but it's the lowest corridor that hears the truth first." Trevor turned toward them. "You're all seriously siding with the janitor over me?" "No," Mara said. "We're acknowledging what's always been true. You just made it too public to ignore." Trevor looked back at the board, and for a second, the mask cracked. Not completely, but enough. The carefully rehearsed poise faltered under the pressure of something he'd never prepared for: irrelevance. He made another move, his rook, hasty, pushing to a square that meant nothing. And Mason replied without looking up. His knight locked down the last open file. Trevor exhaled hard through his nose. "I could walk away from this board right now." "You could," Mason agreed. "I could tell HR I'm terminating your contract today." "You could do that too." Trevor slammed his palm on the table. Then why do I feel like I already lost? Mason finally looked at him, not with pity, not with gloating, but with something worse, understanding. Because deep down, he said, you know this game only showed what's been true all along. And then, with no flourish, Mason moved his rook. Trevor's king had nowhere to go. The board said what no voice needed to, checkmate. But Mason didn't say the word. He just leaned back and waited. The room was so quiet, you could hear the second hand on someone's wristwatch. Trevor didn't touch his king. He didn't need to. Everyone else already saw it fall. Trevor stared at the board like it had personally betrayed him. He didn't speak, didn't move. His hand hovered near the king for a breath too long, then pulled away. But the damage wasn't in the pieces. It was in the silence. In the room that no longer feared him. The cameras were still rolling. The lounge lights still cast soft reflections over the mahogany surface. His staff hadn't left. None of them looked away. He was used to being watched with admiration. This was something else. Reckoning. Mason didn't gloat. He didn't shift in his seat. His expression was unchanged, unreadable, except for the faintest undercurrent of calm resolve. He wasn't here to bury Trevor. He was here to make sure the man never forgot what respect felt like, when it came from the person you thought didn't matter. Across the room, Daria had lowered her arms. She was no longer evaluating. She was simply observing. Trevor broke the silence first. You think you've made your point. Mason blinked once. I didn't come here with a point. That truth landed heavier than any insult could have. Trevor opened his mouth, but nothing useful emerged. You came here with an agenda, Trevor tried again. You played into this performance like the rest of them. Mason finally rose. His movement wasn't abrupt. It was intentional, measured, the way a man moves after walking miles without letting anyone know how tired he really is. I came here to work, he said. Same as every day before. Trevor scoffed and leaned back in his chair, arms crossing his chest. Congratulations, then. You've turned a company chess match into a morality play. A soft voice cut in from the left. No, Mara said. You did that. When you mocked a man for having a daughter, when you made power more important than decency. Trevor's eyes flicked toward her, but she didn't flinch. You know how many people you've made small over the years, she asked. Mason just happened to be the one with the skill to remind you what that costs. The air tightened again, but not with tension, with clarity. Because everyone in that room had felt it before. The way Trevor treated anyone who wasn't critical to his next promotion, his next valuation, his next exit strategy. It hadn't been just Mason on that board. It was the receptionist he cut off mid-sentence. The junior developer he never remembered. The assistant he once fired for asking a question in a meeting. And Mason had done what no one else dared to. He'd made the silence visible. Trevor pushed back from the table suddenly, standing too fast, the chair squeaking beneath him. I don't need to stay for this, he said, but no one responded. Not even Mason. And that silence? That was louder than the checkmate. Trevor's gaze swept the room again, looking for someone, anyone, to back him, to nod, to smirk, to do what people had always done around him. But no one moved. He turned and left. Not a word, not a threat. Just the hollow sound of polished shoes hitting tile as he disappeared down the hallway, the doors sighing shut behind him. The match was over. And not a single piece had been tipped. The lounge remained quiet for a long moment. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy across the group, not because they'd watched a man lose a game, but because they'd watched a mask slip. Then, slowly, James walked forward and reset the board. No ceremony. No announcement. Just hands placing pawns back into starting rows. Lila joined him, then Daria, then someone from finance, then HR. One by one, people gathered. Not around Trevor's exit, but around Mason. The board, now reassembled, was no longer about spectacle. It was about learning. And without prompting, someone asked, "Would you teach us?" Mason didn't respond right away. Then he turned to the board, eyes scanning its fresh lines, and quietly said, "Only if you want to lose a few times first?" That broke the tension. A ripple of low laughter moved through the room. Genuine, light, a relief after hours of held breath. Mara approached and leaned in. "He'll be back, you know." Mason nodded. "Probably." "You afraid of that?" "No." "Why not?" He looked toward the glass doors Trevor had vanished through, then down at the chair the CEO had left behind. Empty now, under the same lights, just furniture again. "Because you don't have to win every game to keep the board," he said. And with that, he picked up the chipped knight from his pocket and set it gently on the edge of the table. No fanfare, just a quiet place to rest, a legacy. The knight stayed on the edge of the board, long after the room emptied. Even as the crowd thinned, even as someone turned off the overhead lights and the cameras were shut down, no one dared to move it. The chipped piece sat like a relic, its worn edges catching slivers of lamplight, the only proof that something irreversible had happened. Mason stood in the hallway, shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours. His cleaning cart waited beside him, quiet and ordinary, filled with the same tools he used every day. There was no applause, no speech, just the familiar echo of polished floors and distant conversations from offices that had always felt a floor too high. The match was over, but the story was still moving. Across the building, something subtle had shifted, not procedurally yet, but atmospherically. The kind of shift that doesn't come with memos or all-hands meetings, but in how people glanced at the elevator when he stepped in how they greeted him now, not out of politeness, but with something closer to recognition. Respect without instruction. Daria found him outside the supply closet later that evening. She was holding 2 coffees, both nearly cold. No one said how long she'd been waiting. "I wasn't sure how you take it," she said, offering him one. "I don't," he replied, accepting it anyway. They leaned against opposite walls, no rush in their silence. "He'll try to recover," she said eventually. "Probably spin it into some offbeat leadership lesson. Frame you as an inspirational underdog. Invite you to speak at company functions." "I won't," Mason said simply. "I know." Another pause stretched between them, the kind where words weren't necessary but still helpful. She glanced down at the rim of her cup. "For what it's worth, when I saw you tonight, I didn't feel proud of the company. I felt ashamed it took this long." Mason looked up at her. "It didn't take long, it took one afternoon." "No," she said, "it took 10 years of everyone pretending not to notice you." He didn't argue. That was the thing about time. It could be stretched thin over silence until it disappeared completely. "I always thought the system would catch people like him," she admitted, "eventually." "It doesn't," Mason replied. "Systems protect themselves. Until someone inside changes the questions." She looked over at him, brows raised. "Is that what you think you did? Changed the question?" "No," he said. "I just reminded them who was asking it." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That night he rode the service elevator down with Eloise's lunchbox in one hand and the chipped knight still in his pocket. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. The same lights he'd replaced when no one else wanted to climb the ladder. In the parking garage, his car looked smaller than it had that morning. Not physically, but in proportion to everything that had happened. He got in. The seat creaked in that familiar way it always did. The fabric was worn from years of early shifts and late drives home. The glove box held Eloise's half-solved crossword puzzle. The back seat still had her science fair project, taped together with hopeful hands. He sat there for a moment, breathing in the scent of hand soap and coffee, and something else beneath it all, dust, maybe, or resolve. At home, the lights were off except for the one above the kitchen sink, a single bulb casting a warm halo on the counter, just enough to guide him in. Eloise was asleep on the couch, her schoolwork still spread across the cushions. Her hand rested on the side of her head, curled in mid-thought. She had fallen asleep trying to finish a chapter he'd promised to help her with. He walked over quietly, lifted the papers, and placed them neatly on the table. Then he bent down and touched her shoulder gently. She stirred. "Is it over?" He nodded. "It's over. Did you win?" He paused. The question sat in the air like it deserved a careful answer. "I remembered who I was," he said. "And I made sure he did too." She blinked sleepily, then smiled. "So, that means yes." He smiled back, softer now. "Yeah, I guess it does." He picked her up, light as always, and carried her to her room. The old floorboard creaked near the doorway, just like it always had. The nightlight flickered to life with its dim amber glow. He tucked her in, brushing her hair gently from her face. Then he turned back into the hallway, reaching into his pocket for the chipped night. He set it on the kitchen counter, next to the half-empty box of cereal and the unopened mail. It didn't need to be on the board anymore. It had done its job. Morning came without fanfare. No headlines, no emails, no company-wide announcement about the match, no sudden change in Mason's badge status or pay grade. The building still buzzed with startup urgency. Phones rang, keycards beeped. The espresso machine hissed to life like nothing extraordinary had happened. But Mason noticed it in the spaces between the noise. The woman from finance who always passed him without a glance now offered a quiet nod. The intern who once avoided eye contact asked if he needed help lifting the supply box. Even the elevators seemed slower to close when he walked toward them, held open by someone waiting. Not out of obligation, but respect. And at the heart of it all, the lounge was quiet. The chessboard sat reset. The chipped knight was gone from the edge. In its place, a simple note had been taped to the board. "Everyone has a game worth watching. ER." Mason didn't smile, but something in his chest eased. Eloise had left it clearly. He could see her handwriting in the initials. She must have asked someone to tape it up before school. Or maybe someone saw her doing it and decided not to stop her. Either way, no one had taken it down. He didn't linger in the lounge. He had work to do. Floors to mop, trash bins to empty, lights to check on the 5th floor that kept flickering from a bad ballast. The building didn't stop running just because its walls had listened for once. As he moved through the hallways, he caught sight of a meeting in progress behind the glass of Conference Room C. Trevor's chair was empty. The man leading the discussion was Mara. She was standing, not because the projector was angled high, but because she wanted everyone to know the seat at the end of the table was no longer untouchable. Later that afternoon, a new email landed in Mason's inbox. It wasn't from HR. It wasn't from facilities. It was from Daria. Subject, Internal Advisor Position. Strategy Unit. Message. If you're willing to lend us your mind part-time, we're willing to shut up and listen. D. He didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if he would at all. He folded the screen closed and returned to the hallway, cartwheels squeaking against tile, same as they always had. But something inside him felt lighter, not because he'd been seen, because Eloise had seen him win without losing himself. That night, as the building cleared and fluorescent lights hummed against the quiet, he wheeled his cart toward the service elevator. The chipped knight was in his pocket again, not as a weapon, not as a symbol, just as a reminder. The elevator doors opened. Inside stood Mara and James. Both paused. Mason stepped in. Mara smiled. "We were just talking about you." "Dangerous," he said, deadpan. James laughed. "We think Trevor's laying low, PR's rerouting questions. Legal's doing what they do best." "And you?" Mara asked. He looked at the floor number light blinking above them. "I'm just finishing my shift." She nodded like that answer was exactly what she hoped for. As the elevator slowed, she turned to him one last time. "You changed more than a boardroom," she said. Mason didn't respond. He just stepped out into the hall, pushed his cart toward the supply closet, and disappeared around the corner. Back at home, Eloise was already in her pajamas, sprawled on the living room rug, with the chessboard open again. "I'm playing both sides," she told him. "But one of them has a disadvantage." "Why?" "Because they assume the other side won't notice what they're doing." He knelt beside her. "What happens when they do?" She smiled, moving a pawn. "Then the whole game flips." He reached out, tapped one of the bishops into position, and whispered, "Your move." If you've ever seen silence speak louder than arrogance, you know this story. If you've ever watched someone underestimated until it was too late to stop them, you've felt what we just lived. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad whispered, "Don't drink that water." Then the CEO's daughter started coughing. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell us in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?